Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome back to AJ 102, and tonight's chapter is going to be chapter 11, and we're going to talk about issues concerning police conduct. Now, this chapter really could be broken up into two different lectures, but I'm going to try to get through the entire thing under just one. So again, I would ask you to read in your textbook to make sure that you thoroughly go through the chapters, and I'm just going to kind of hit the high points as we go through. As always, I would like you to look at the definitions in your textbook on page 422 and also see if you can answer some of the do you know questions that are on that same page, because a lot of those are very, very helpful as we start to move through this particular chapter. So this chapter is going to focus on issues related to how officers behave on the job. First, looking at a brief review of this word out there called discretion. And next, we're going to look at the critical issue of discrimination in enforcing the laws based on gender, class, or race, and how that discrimination differs from disparity. So we're going to kind of look at those two words, discrimination and disparity. Then we're going to talk a little bit about police use of force, police pursuit, civil liability, and issues associated with police conduct. Now, on our discussion board as one of the assignments, or more than likely, I'll post a couple of other videos and ask for some feedback. But I think that, again, I want everybody to keep an open mind with this, because police use of force, while very prevalent in the news right now, a lot of people don't understand it. And I am not one to sit here and to say that we do everything perfectly. It's just like any other profession. We're trained to do a job, and sometimes we need to adjust or alter our training in order to make things, better. And, think of it like this. Put yourself in an officer's shoes where you have 1 to 2 seconds to react to a movement or something that somebody else is doing, and that reaction is going to basically define you, if you will, as a law enforcement officer. So if somebody is walking towards you and you tell them, hey, stop, hey, let me see your hands, they don't do that. They reach into their back pocket really quick, and in a matter of 1 second, they pull their hand out. Do you wait to see what the issue is to further define what you think the issue might be, or do you act upon that? And we're going to talk a little bit about that. And as we look at things on the discussion board, remember, everybody has an opinion, and I want everyone to be very respectful and mindful of those opinions as well. So policing faces several issues in the 21st century. Some have existed for decades and others are relatively new. Each do you know, and we put that in quotes, presents more than facts. Each presents major issues that face policing because the questions have no correct answer. They're very controversial. Notice also that some particular subjects we're going to talk about, such as discretion, have, we talked a little bit about that earlier, but we're going to kind of further define a little bit more and see that some of these things are very controversial depending upon how you think about it. So let's start off. So discretion, what is it? Does it even matter? It does. And discretion has been a theme throughout this text, just as citizens can decide to obey the laws or not. Police agencies and their officers can decide which offenses to actively seek to control and which offenses to simply ignore, which services to provide, and at what level. Police discretion can become an issue of controversy when claims of discrimination arise. So police discretion is the freedom of an agency or individual officer to choose to act or not. Whether such discretion is positive or negative can be an issue. So let's look at something really simple, and I'm not going to try to eat up a lot of time in this lecture, but some of these things we're going to have to chase these rabbits. So I pull you over for speeding, and you're a great guy, you're a great gal, you've never done anything wrong, but I pull you over because you're speeding. My discretion here is going to be whether to give you a ticket or not. Now, is it fair that maybe I gave you the ticket and didn't give the person that I stopped before you a ticket? Or is it fair that I gave you the ticket because you're mouthier than the person that I stopped before you? Or I didn't give you the ticket because you're a friend of mine. So these are discretionary things that law enforcement has to deal with. And let me throw this out here real quick, and I'm going to let you think about it. And at the end, I know you can't remind me, I'll try to remind myself. Let's say you're a traffic officer and you're sworn to uphold the law just like every other officer, and you're working traffic, and the next car you pull over is doing 80 and a 40 in a school zone, okay, which would actually be like 15 or 25, but let's just say that they're speeding through there. And you pull them over and it's your mom. How many of you would enforce the law to the fullest extent and issue your mother a citation? And how many of you would not? Hold that thought. Discretion might be viewed on a continuum from low to high. Low discretion situations include those involving routine activities such as executing a search warrant, responding to a citizen complaint, or seeing an obvious violation of the law, for example, like what we talked about, a motorist running the red light. The officer usually need not ponder what action they're going to take, although they could. High discretion situations in contract are less clear-cut. For example, responding to a call from a citizen reporting a fight going on next door. Upon arrival, the officer has to determine what the situation is and sort out who the victim might be, or who the suspect is, or if they're both at fault. The high discretion incidents invite both intentional and unintentional abuses of discretionary police power. Now, that doesn't mean that, don't take that the wrong way, meaning that we just go out there and we abuse people. Okay. What it's saying is that the high discretion incidents invite both intentional or unintentional, misuses of discretionary police power. One of the most important discretionary options that police officers have would be what? If you said arrest somebody, then you were correct. If the decision is to arrest, then the discretionary power of the prosecutor will come into play. And if you decide not to arrest, then there you are. Now, there are some situations where you have to make an arrest. So, those are sometimes written by policy or by state law or other legislation where you have to make an arrest. So part of the discretionary process, though, that tends to come out of it, would be disparity, discrimination or disparity, as a matter of fact, in policing. And basing it on gender issues or class issues or racial issues or gender and use of force. And we're going to talk about the use of force continuum in a few minutes. But the guarantee of equal protection under the law to all citizens is a fundamental principle in our democracy. When officers fail to treat citizens equally because of things like economic status or religion or age or what have you, discrimination occurs. So let me cut to the chase and kind of tell you the difference between the two. Discrimination is showing a preference in treating individuals or groups, or failing to treat equals equally, especially illegal, unequal treatment based on race, religion, sex, or age. Some male traffic officers, for example, are known to issue warnings to females who violate traffic laws and to issue tickets to males for the same violation. Question for you, is this a matter of discrimination or disparity? We'll answer it in a second. Disparity refers to a simple difference, not necessarily caused by any kind of bias. For example, if there are more male drivers and if they more frequently break the laws, the difference in the number of traffic tickets issued to male drivers would be a function of disparity, not discrimination. Okay, another example, in a high school, most students will be between 16 and 18 years of age. This reflects age disparity, not age discrimination. Does that make sense? So again, discrimination, showing a preference in treating individuals or groups or failing to treat equals equally, especially illegal unequal treatment based on race, religion, sex, or age. Disparity, a simple difference, not necessarily caused by any type of bias. So hopefully you got that. Gender issues, there is much controversy about whether study results indicate a pattern of systematic discrimination or disparity that is related to other factors such as involvement in crime. When you talk about gender issues, the differential treatment of men and women by police is seldom raised as an issue. Why is it that so many more men than women are arrested and incarcerated? Are women better drivers and therefore get stopped for less violations? Disparity. Are women less violent? Disparity. Do women commit fewer crimes? Disparity. Or are women given preferential treatment? Discrimination. Okay, limited research has really kind of addressed that issue. So I hope that those were some examples to where you could talk about, or you understand the difference between the two. So class issues, another area receiving limited attention is discriminatory policing based on a person's economic level. More than a half century ago, in a case, Griffin versus Illinois, 1956, Justice Hugo Black declared, and this is quote, "There can be no equal justice where the kind of trial a man gets depends upon the amount of money he has," end quote. To many people, the O.J. Simpson double murder trial was a blatant example of unlimited financial resources basically being able to buy a not guilty verdict. So, at the law enforcement level, those who are poor are much more likely to come to the attention of the police simply because they are on the streets more than those who are not poor. And I'm not making light of that, but these are some facts that have been drawn out. Many people that you might run into in policing will be homeless, and some of their behaviors, such as sleeping on park benches, have been made illegal, changing a social problem kind of into a law enforcement problem. And if a poor person does have a vehicle, it is often needed in repair, resulting in the person being ticketed for faulty equipment. You see where I'm going with this? So it doesn't mean that they're bad folks. It means that typically you may run into those folks more often. So in a case called Florida versus Bostic, 1991, a 28-year-old black man, Terrence Bostic, on his way from Miami to Atlanta, was asleep on a bus that had stopped in Fort Lauderdale. Police officers boarded to work the bus looking for drug dealers wearing raid jackets with Broward County Sheriff's insignias and logos on it, displaying badges. One one of the officers was holding a gun. He awakened Mr. Bostic and asked to search his bag. Bostic agreed, and the officers found a pound of cocaine. Had Bostic been traveling in a private vehicle instead of public transit, it is much more likely his illicit drugs would have gone undiscovered. So it's kind of an interesting court case. Bostic was convicted, and on appeal, the case found its way to the Florida Supreme Court, which overturned his conviction. His lawyer argued that given the circumstances, most reasonable people would not feel free to ignore the police's request. Further, no reasonable person would agree to allow a search of a bag containing that much cocaine. The case was then sent to the Supreme Court, which overturned the Florida Supreme Court's decision. But you can see the ins and outs of the court systems working here, and some of the rationales that come up with this. So as we start to look at different things here, let me make sure that I don't skip over a couple of things before we get there. So we're gonna back up just a little bit more and continue on this one little part right here. So we talked about disparity, and I gave you a couple of definitions with that, and discrimination. On page 424 in your textbook down at the bottom, figure 11.1 is a kind of a discrimination disparity continuum chart. And that might be a good thing for you to look at in order to get kind of a better understanding. So racial profiling, where does that kind of fit in? Well, racial profiling refers to any police-initiated action that relies on the race, ethnicity, or national origin rather than on behavior of an individual for the police to believe a particular individual is engaged in criminal activity. The practice of racial profiling is illegal and is typically addressed in almost every department policy that I know of that requires officers to refrain from engaging in it. So, question, as we start to think of what I just described as racial profiling. So how do you police a certain area if, let's say, 75% of your community is a certain ethnicity, and somebody basically comes to the station to complain, to say, well, they stopped me because I am of this particular ethnic group? Because the fact that 75% of the community is this particular ethnicity, wouldn't it stand to reason that they would have a higher probability of being stopped? So, so you have to, when you look at some of this stuff, a lot of people throw out these terms. Well, they stopped me because, they racially profiled me. Well, there's more to it than that, because you have to look at the definition. Okay, police-initiated action that relies on the race, ethnicity, or national origin rather than on the behavior of the person. Okay, so that needs to be there in order for it to actually be something that would be deemed as racial profiling. So along with that, as we talk about a few things, especially specific to racial profiling and things like that, to avoid charges of racial profiling, officers must focus on a person's behavior, okay, in their profiling. That doesn't mean, now keep in mind, that doesn't mean that you can't profile someone. They do it at airports all the time. They do it at bus terminals. They do it for drug smugglers. There's drug interdiction. There's all these other things that are there. So you can still profile, okay? But you need to focus on the person's behavior. Many departments are training officers in behavior patterns, a technique originated in Israel and used to look at how an individual behaves at an airport or in an airport environment as a way of determining a potential threat. So, not just by the color of the person or the ethnicity, but add a couple of facts. How are they behaving? Are they pacing back and forth? Are they looking around? Are they sweating? these are other factors, not just the fact that they're a representative of a certain group. So hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. Also, many departments are approaching claims of racial profiling through what they call data collection. However, data collection and effective analysis can be, it can be costly. So, but collecting data on those that you stop and looking back and seeing the gender or the ethnicity of those that you're stopping is becoming more prevalent. And then keep in mind the whole immigration issue. And we're not going to like dig too deep on this, but we have to talk about it. Racial profiling has become kind of embroiled a little bit in the immigration issue. So, an estimated 10.8 million illegal immigrants reside in this country and have become an increasing focus of controversy for some. And there are several challenges facing law enforcement agency and jurisdictions with large immigrant populations. And, some of the challenges are that a lot of them don't speak English, or sometimes immigrants are very reluctant to report a crime because there's maybe a trust or fear issue with law enforcement. Effects of the federal law enforcement actions, confusion about whether and to what extent local police enforce. Do they go out and enforce the immigration laws or not? Misunderstandings based on cultural differences. Personal interactions between immigrants and police officers that damage goodwill and trust. So all of these things are issues relating to immigration. So we have to always keep this in mind. The immigration issue centers on whether police officers should be enforcers of immigration laws or should seek to build trust with those immigrants as advocated by community policing. Because community policing is, that's the new term, and I think we've talked about that kind of a couple chapters back. So to kind of finish up the little profiling piece, as a legitimate law enforcement tool, a central problem with racial profiling is that profiling has been a valuable tool in policing for decades. At airports, law enforcement security personnel are taught to watch for certain traits. Paying for a ticket in cash, no luggage, nervousness, things like that. So, thus it might be appropriate to change the name of profiling instead of calling it like profiling to maybe characteristics or building a case or something that basically sets race apart from the suspect descriptors, if that kind of makes any sense. So that's something also that we can look at in order to deal with some of the issues that we're handling. So guarantee on equal protection. Well, all of the guarantees when it comes to use of force are, we all have the same guarantees. Force, real quick, first is a action taken to compel an individual to comply with an officer's request. So the International Association of Chiefs of Police, or IACP, defines force as that amount of effort required by police to compel compliance from an unwilling subject. Okay, and unwilling, because if they were willing, there wouldn't be any, compel in there. When most people think of use of force, they envision some type of active, hands-on, or physical tactic. However, it is important to recognize that mere officer presence in itself is a use of force, in that most citizens, when in the presence of a uniformed officer, hopefully will act lawfully. Now, there are 5 recognized and accepted purposes, commonly referred to as the rules of engagement, that justify the legitimate use of force. And those are self-defense, defense of others, effect an arrest, prevent escape, and overcome resistance. And we'll talk a little bit more on that. But back here on the slide, the guarantee of equal protection against reasonable force, against excessive force. I mean, not against reasonable force, I'm very sorry. To use reasonable force to guard against excessive force. There are things that we have called less lethal force, and we'll talk a little bit more about those in a few minutes. And avoiding the use of force-related problems and officers' rights and use of force lawsuits. So let's talk about all those for just a real quick second, so we can kind of identify exactly what reasonable force is. First of all, on page 434 in your textbook, there is what they call a use of force continuum, and it would be very good for you to look at that. Reasonable force, what constitutes reasonable force, was established in a case law by the name of Graham versus Connor, 1989. And basically, reasonable force is force no greater than that needed to achieve the desired end, meaning to take the person into custody, meaning to get the person to stop fighting. Now, that Graham versus Connor court case listed 4 factors against which an officer's actions must be measured. So when we look at that, number 1 is the immediate threat or of serious physical harm to the officer or others. 2, the degree to which the situation is tense, uncertain, and rapidly evolving. 3, the nature of the crime at issue. And number 4, whether the subject is resisting arrest or attempting to evade arrest by flight. So that's the reasonable force. Now, excessive force is defined by the IACP as the application of an amount and or frequency of force greater than that required to compel compliance from a willing or unwilling subject. Okay, so that's the excessive force. When you look at less lethal force, there's a couple of options. There are 6 that are listed in the textbook. Less lethal force is force that has less potential for causing death or serious injury than do traditional tactics. So as law enforcement technology expands, a wider variety of response options are becoming available. For instance, where an increased level of force is necessary but deadly force is too extreme, there are now a variety of less lethal alternatives, basically. So ranging from mace or CN or CS tear gas, or what's commonly known as pepper spray, projectile launchers, specialty impact munitions like beanbags, or tasers. All of these are different less lethal options, and we'll take a real quick look at a couple of them. So restraints, that they're pretty well self-explanatory. So being able to restrain somebody, that is technically a use of force, no matter what other non-lethal lethal control options a department provides. Officers will always receive some means of restraining people, most typically by handcuffs. So proper training and proper use of handcuffs is important. Aerosols or chemical agents, CN, CS gas, OC or pepper spray, those are another means of less lethal control. Impact weapons are excellent tools for crowd control and rioting crowds. Things like rubber balls, rubber slugs, bean bags, those are things that are also considered to be less than lethal. Conducted energy devices, also referred to as stun guns or most commonly known as tasers. Those are also another option that law enforcement officers carry with them. So when you talk, so that's kind of the less lethal force aspect. Now, when you talk deadly force, is generally defined as any force that can reasonably be expected to cause death or serious bodily injury. The authority to use deadly force is an awesome responsibility when considering the justifiable use of deadly force. 2, interrelated rights are important. Okay, the legal right to use such force and the moral right compelling the officer to do so. So justification for use of deadly force must consider those two components, the legal right and the need to apprehend the subject or suspect compared with the arresting officer's safety and the value of human life. And there's a landmark court case in your book on page 442, Tennessee versus Gardner in 1985. Basically bars police from shooting to kill fleeing felons unless there is an imminent danger to life. This ruling invalidated state laws passed in several states a long time ago that allowed law enforcement officers to use deadly force to prevent the escape of a fleeing felon, and that no longer is the issue. Also in your textbook on page 443 is a summary of law on the use of force, so that would be kind of a really good thing for you to read as well. So as I stated before, in your textbook, there is a really nice kind of a chart, if you will, that's the use of force continuum. It's on page 434, I believe, and it'll show you on top the officer's response and underneath the suspect's behavior. And you know, these use of force continuums are a little bit controversial in a sense that sometimes they're not very clear. So the amount of force used can be placed on a continuum. No physical force used with a cooperative subject, to ordinary force used with a person who is resisting, to extraordinary force used to a person who is assaultive. So not all continuums used by police departments are consistent with one illustrated in this book, so just kind of keep that in mind. And a lot of departments have begun moving away from a straight line continuum to more of a circular one, partly because of criticism that the former option suggests a linear progression on how force must be applied and kind of sets unrealistic expectations that the force application has to go through a progression. So what they mean is, and I don't know if you can see the arrow here, but so basically it's saying that if the suspect does this, then the officer has to do this. Well, the question then is, what if the suspect does this, violent assault? The old school is that the officer would have to go through these steps in order to get to something that's equal or above what the suspect is doing. That's not conducive to the officer, and somebody's going to get hurt, more or less the officer. So if you have a person that's like passively resisting here, they're verbally unwilling to cooperate, this and that, and the officer is giving them commands like take your hands out of your pockets, and the person reaches in their pocket and pulls out a big knife, the officer doesn't have the time to maybe use physical force to gain compliance with their hands because they could get, you know, stabbed, killed, or whatever. So they may have to escalate that use of force, thus passing over a step. So hopefully you're getting what I'm saying as we talk about this. So that's why they're talking about using the circular version of that instead of the other one. So back to the deadly force thing, and I apologize for backing up, but I want to make sure you kind of got that. So there's another thing out there that we talk about before we get into like police pursuits, and it's under the use of force heading, and it's what they call contagious fire, the phenomenon of what contagious fire means is that it's the phenomenon that occurs when one officer shoots, causing other officers to have a kind of a propensity to also shoot, even if they are unaware of the justification for shooting. Research does show that on average, extra shots are generally beyond an officer's control and are more likely to be an involuntary reaction under certain stress conditions, kind of a non-conscious decision without maliciously, you know, without malicious motivation, if you will. So along with that, we talk about shooting unarmed suspects. When police shoot an unarmed suspect, the public is often outraged, and sometimes I see why, and some question why the officer could not just like shoot the suspect in the knee or something like that? And the answer to that is that's not how we train. Okay, when an officer determines that there is a justifiable cause to use deadly force, they are trained not to shoot to injure, but to shoot to end the threat, to stop the threat. That's the way they are trained. And sometimes, unfortunately, that equates to shooting and somebody is subsequently killed. Another term out there that you might hear is the term conditioned hesitation. Many factors can lead to an officer hesitating in a kill zone, and any such hesitation in a crisis can probably cost the officer his or her life. Factors contributing to this particular problem include training, the officer's level of physical fitness, and the officer's mindset and attitudes, suspect or subject's factors, and fear. So conditioned hesitation is based, is easier understood with the analogy of an officer training at the range. So I'm at the range and I'm training and I shoot 6 shots from the 5-yard line. No stress, no nothing. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Then the person gets on the intercom and says, okay, move back to the 15-yard lines. On my count, 7 shots to center mass, ready, begin. And you pick up your brass and you take your time and this and that. Well, if you continually train like that in a very stressful situation to where you might be taking fire or something similar to that, you might revert to your training, which a lot of people do, thus hesitating because you're not training for real life or those types of simulations. So that's the conditioned hesitation. And then canines, real quick, is a deadly force. Dogs have been tremendous help to law enforcement officers locating and apprehending criminal suspects. This use, however, often requires the dog apply force at the handler's command on a suspect, and thus falls under the Fourth Amendment requirements for reasonableness. Several court decisions around the country have indicated that law enforcement trained canines are considered a less lethal alternative and a safer means of applying force, but you just have to keep all of these other things into consideration when you're talking about everything else. So now we're going to move into police pursuits. One controversial type of force used by police is a pursuit, which may result in injury or death for fleeing suspects, pursuing officers, or innocent bystanders. Vehicle pursuits can be extremely dangerous and very dangerous activity for law enforcement. Pursuits are particularly unique in that their dangers are often aimed directly at innocent victims. Studies suggest that more than 300 civilians are killed each year in police vehicle pursuits, and that's from an article written by Yates in 2009. Now, a pursuit itself is defined as an active attempt by a law enforcement officer on duty, in a patrol car to apprehend one or more occupants of a moving motor vehicle, providing the driver of such vehicle is aware that the attempt is, that there is an attempt, and is resisting apprehension by maintaining or increasing his or her speed, or by ignoring the law enforcement officer's attempt to stop them. And I say his or her because there are both men and women law enforcement officers and both men and women criminals that are involved in pursuits. So one of the myths out there is that if you flee from the police in a motor vehicle after they have attempted to stop you, they are legally obligated to pursue you. That is not true. Okay, there are a variety of factors that dictate whether police will initiate a motor vehicle pursuit with a suspect that they attempt to stop. So there's policy that talks about time of day, day of week, speed zone, amount of traffic, type of crime. Can you get the helicopter up? Are there other options? Do you have a license plate? Can you ID the person again? There's all of these things that are basically out there when it comes to police pursuits and general policy. So the question kind of comes down here to pursue or not to pursue. This controversy over pursuits ranges from those who say pursuit should be totally banned, to those who say pursuit should only be allowed under certain circumstances, to those who say pursuit should be left to the discretion of the officer involved in the incident. The basic dilemma of pursuits is whether the benefits of the potential apprehension outweigh the risk posed to police officers, the public, and the suspects. Perhaps one of the most compelling and ongoing logical reasons for law enforcement's continued interest in high-speed vehicle pursuits has been its concern in balancing the values of crime control and offender apprehension with ensuring the safety of all parties who potentially might be involved: police officers, suspects, victims, bystanders, the public, etc. So, what do you think? Now, on page 449 in your book, under figure 11.3, there's a pursuit management continuum. I would suggest that you would kind of look at that. But, you know, when you balance, if you don't chase anybody in a car and people just drive away from you, are you just letting the crooks get away with it? Should you not pursue them? What if you don't know what type of crime it is? What if it's an armed robbery, kidnapping, and you stop the person as a traffic violation? But you don't know there's a little kid stuffed in the trunk of the car and the guy takes off. I mean, there are so many unknowns, but this is the whole dilemma behind pursue, not pursue. But again, you do have to weigh, you really do. The dilemma is the benefits of potential apprehension versus the risk to yourself, the public, and the suspect. Okay? Because of the high probability of damage to property and people not connected with the pursuit, many advocate discontinuing a policy of police pursuits. In fact, liability concerns have led many departments across the nation to adopt kind of no pursuit policies. And, you know, the department I came from, we still have one, but there are many factors that you need to think about during a police pursuit. And there's kind of a laundry list of them. As noted, pursuit policies range from the total ban to allowing officers to have complete discretion. Most police agencies suggest factors be considered to include in the policy, like the offense, like traffic conditions, like weather. Many departments' pursuit policies include a pursuit continuum similar to those that are established on figure 11.3 that we were just talking about a minute ago. Agencies often also employ some technology to make high-speed pursuits safer, or eliminating them altogether. The most popular are things, and you've probably heard of them, spike strips, where they deploy them in the street. They're retractable barrier strips that can be remotely deployed, and the car runs over it, and there you go. Other technology may also include global positioning systems like GPS tracking systems, aircraft intervention like the helicopter. Get the helicopter up over the vehicle and the helicopter can follow the pursuit better than you can. And then there's this thing called a pit. The pit maneuver, actually. Another tactic used to end a pursuit is the pit maneuver, which only highly trained officers should be authorized to use. It is known by several different names, but is an acronym for Precision Immobilization Technique, a method used to turn an offender's car sideways with the goal of having the person lose control and come to a stop. So sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't work as well. But it all comes down to liability. There's a case law, County of Sacramento versus Lewis, 1998. Because so many police vehicle pursuits end in crashes and some in fatalities, lawsuits for pursuits are inevitable. Departments can, however, minimize the risk of lawsuits by creating a pursuit policy that balances the need for apprehending offenders in the interest of justice with the need to protect citizens from the risks associated with pursuits. County of Sacramento versus Lewis, 1998, set a standard for liability in police pursuits. Very, very quickly, in this case, 16-year-old Philip Lewis was a passenger on a motorcycle driven by 18-year-old Brian Willard. When Willard committed a traffic violation, Sacramento County Sheriff's deputy tried to stop the motorcycle. The driver sped away. The deputy followed, and during the pursuit, the chase reached speeds of about 100 miles an hour. The pursuit ended when the motorcycle tipped over and Lewis was struck and killed by the patrol car. The Ninth Circuit Court ruled that the deputy was liable for Lewis's death by showing, here it is, quote, deliberate indifference to or reckless disregard for a person's right to life and personal security, end quote. Now, there's more though, so don't panic. The Supreme Court, however, overturned this ruling and held only conduct that shows an intent on the part of the officer to cause harm unrelated to the legitimate object of making the arrest will meet the test of shocking and arbitrary conduct actionable as deprivation of substantive due process. As a result of Lewis, this case, in high-speed vehicle pursuit cases, Section 1983 liability ensues only if the conduct of the officer shocks the conscience of the court. So if you're trying to make the arrest and you don't end up shocking the conscience of the court by that conduct actionable, okay, they talked about that deprivation of due process, then you won't be held liable. But if you reach that threshold, then you will be liable. So liability, here's the definition so you know. A legal obligation incurred for an injury suffered or compelled about that results from failure to conduct a specific task or activity within a given standard. So that's kind of that. Civil liability, as discussed, many aspects of police work, pursuits, things like that we're vulnerable to that. Searches and arrests have the potential for lawsuits, as do failures to investigate and make arrests. So again, liability, a legal obligation incurred for an injury suffered or complained of that results from failure to conduct a specific task or activity within a given standard. So, that's it. Now, along with that, keep in mind that, today's concern for civil liability is quite evident in law enforcement agencies' policies and practices. So you'll see a lot of that liability stuff in there. And there's this thing out there, this word, lawsuit paranoia, which is basically litigophobia. It sounds kind of funny, but that's what it is, which is the fear of litigation. So fear of being sued can cause confusion regarding which action to take in a given situation. It's kind of like one of those you're damned if you do, damned if you don't dilemma. So, here's an example. As an example here, for a while, citizens in need of life-saving assistance were filing and winning lawsuits against those who responded for them for the injury sustained during the assistance or for other kind of ludicrous reasons. So people grew reluctant to help them. So if you got in a car crash and you were laying in your car, somebody comes to help you and you pull them out of the car, the people that got pulled out of the car were saying, well, because they pulled me out of the car, I got hurt, so therefore I'm suing you. So people didn't want to get involved anymore. Well, after a while, they had something that came out. So to protect well-intentioned folks, the Good Samaritan law was passed that required a showing of gross wanton or willful negligence before someone could be sued. But that's how bad the police lawsuits or liability kind of issue got. So we talked about here that litigophobia and what that really means. And, SWAT, that's another one that really talks about, liability. SWAT teams should avoid unnecessarily damaging property and things like that. And SWAT teams are usually called in when it's the worst of the worst and people are barricaded and people are armed and things like that. But there are a lot of lawsuits that come out of SWAT teams. So, when you're trying to reduce civil liability, which is kind of the ending part of this slide right here, you really do have to articulate what's going on, articulate the facts. Okay, really look at the facts, explain what it is that you're doing, and then justify through policy or what have you on exactly what it is that you are doing or did in order to bring that situation to an end. So quickly, because we are starting to run out of time here, corruption, ethics, and integrity. So what constitutes corruption? Well, corruption is a violation of integrity through the abuse of one's role or position or the influencing of a person in authority, either for personal benefit or the benefit of another. So corruption occurs when an officer misuses their authority for personal gain, including accepting gratuities, and the gratuity is like getting something for free. The key element of corruption behavior are that the conduct, 1, is prohibited by law or rule, 2, involves the misuse of position, and 3, involves a reward or personal gain for the officer or the individual. So on page 455, because we are running out of time, under figure 11.4, there's a corruption continuum. And just with the use of force and pursuits, a continuum does exist to describe the transition from honest cop to corrupt cop. And they have this thing called a continuum of compromise that describes the transition from an honest officer to a corrupt officer, that slippery slope when an officer begins to take gratuities or tokens of appreciation or things like that. And think about it. When you start to accept things from people, okay, then those people are going to basically expect things from you. And that is the start of that continuum of compromise. So how does corruption arise? It's that slippery slope. It's maybe the noble cause. I'm out to arrest the drug dealer, and I'm going to be overzealous. Or the ends versus means, meaning that, yes, I'm going to arrest this person, but I'm going to violate the Fourth Amendment and search and seizure, but it doesn't matter because the end justifies the means, because I'm going to make sure that I get them in custody. So that never is good, because you're always going to catch them again. Above the law, meaning like, are you just above the law? We don't have to do it. And I use the analogy of you're a traffic officer and you're out there writing tickets for tinted windows to everybody, but yet your windows are tinted the same. So how fair is that? To where, are you above the law and you're going to go out and actually write tickets to people for something that you violate on a daily basis? So there are those things like speeding and stuff like that. Okay, bad apples. Often the argument is heard that just a few bad apples can ruin the entire barrel. So a few cops can ruin entire departments. So managers, leaders have to start looking at ways to promote integrity and ethical behavior that adheres to the highest standard. And these are all things that are listed on page 456 and 457 in your book. So how do we learn about ethics in law enforcement? Well, I mean, there's a lot of training things that we can do. There's a code of ethics that law enforcement has. And what are ethics, I guess? Well, ethics involves moral behavior, doing what is considered right and just. Police managers may provide ethical leadership by helping officers develop their ethical decision-making skills, training, things like that. So ethics involves moral behavior, doing what is considered right and just, and understanding that the rules and standards that govern that particular profession that you're in. The myth out there, it is an unwritten rule that all police officers support and actively promote this thing they call the code of silence in law enforcement. Well, that's not true. Okay, while some level of that may exist in differing agencies to different degrees, the newer culture, the newer generation of educated, community-oriented police officers rarely and will hardly compromise their own careers because of a coworker's integrity issue. And I can tell you, at 34 years in the business, I can't think of more than one or two times, and I'm not going to say I've never seen it, to where somebody would try to cover up for somebody in an investigation or something like that. Most people understand that this is a great job, a great career, and you don't want to compromise that because somebody else doesn't have the ability to be ethical. So here's this dynamics of police integrity, and you can kind of look at it. It talks about personal forces affecting police personnel, departmental forces affecting police personnel, and then external forces. And it's a very interesting thing when you talk about how these all kind of go together, and you put the police officer there in the middle as their career. And all of these things are pushing against you. And you have to kind of, make sure you maintain the highest levels of standards. So kind of moving on, continuing a little bit with corruption, ethics, integrity, and what have you. The importance of police integrity and core values. There's a thing out there that we call the 3 ethics checked questions. And, is it legal? Is it balanced? And how will it make me feel about myself? Those are things that you can use. Those are questions you can ask yourself when you talk about integrity. Integrity, the most important quality a police officer can possess, is a series of concepts and beliefs that provide structure to an officer's professional and personal ethics. These concepts and beliefs include honesty, honor, morality, allegiance, principled behavior, dedication to the mission. Avoiding bad behavior is not the same as having integrity any more than avoiding grammatical errors can make a Pulitzer Prize winning author. Having integrity is more than simply playing by the rules. To develop officers with integrity, departments need a formal code of ethics, as well as a statement of core values. What does your department stand for? Many internal and external forces interact to influence police integrity daily, which was that chart that I showed you a little while ago. So 3 areas to talk about in which to enhance police integrity and reduce corruption are the application process. Who are you hiring? And what's the process? Okay. Consistent reinforcement of values through training and professionalization, meaning are you training your folks to be the best they can be? Anti-corruption posture and checks and balances. Are you keeping track of your people? The last point on here is IA investigation, and what that really is. An IA investigation is an investigation conducted within an agency by either another agency member or an outside agency, if it's criminal, to basically find out if a violation of department policy or procedure has occurred. So every department has an internal affairs division, or what we call now, because it sounds better, professional standards. And this group, again, is there to investigate department violations. And it can range from a number of things. So, nope, not too bad time-wise. Okay, so we're doing okay. So again, go back and look through the book and make sure you fill in some of the holes in there. To end the chapter here, closely related to discretion is the issue of discrimination versus disparity. We talked about those two. Use of force has been an issue of increased concern for police agencies. We know that by watching TV right now and the news. One form of use of force is the police pursuit, and we know the liability that's attached to that and the dilemma that also comes with that on whether to pursue or not. And then today, concern for civil liability is quite evident in law enforcement agencies, policies, and practices. And as usual, if you have any questions, post them on the general discussion board. Otherwise, that will be it for tonight's lecture, and I will talk more to you next week. Take care.